Captain Nathan Reed, a highly decorated soldier, boarded the Air Haven flight, eager to head home after an arduous 9-month deployment overseas. The relief of finally returning home filled him with hope for a peaceful journey. As he approached the gate in his military uniform, his ID prominently displayed, he held a first-class ticket, a perk granted through Air Haven's Military Appreciation Program. Nathan had always been treated with courtesy during his travels, with staff often offering a warm smile or a kind thank you for his service. These gestures, while small, meant the world to him after months in a foreign land. This time, however, his experience would take a turn he never anticipated. After a smooth boarding process, Nathan walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, his body yearning for the comfort of the first-class seat awaiting him. He felt grateful for the airline's gesture of upgrading his seat, which was part of their initiative to honor military personnel. As he entered the aircraft, a flight attendant stood at the doorway. The woman, appearing to be in her mid-40s, greeted passengers with a half-hearted smile. Nathan returned her greeting politely and handed her his boarding pass when she asked to see it. After glancing at it, she nodded curtly and motioned for him to proceed to the first-class cabin. The walk to his seat felt longer than usual as Nathan passed rows of passengers. Finally, he reached the first-class section, ready to settle in and enjoy a rare moment of relaxation. However, as he approached his assigned seat, the flight attendant reappeared, her demeanor abruptly shifting. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat is not available for you," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. Nathan blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The flight attendant repeated herself, offering no explanation. "This seat is not available. You'll need to move to the back of the plane." Nathan looked around the nearly empty first-class cabin, his confusion growing. "I have a first-class ticket," he said firmly. "I'm part of the military program and was upgraded." The attendant shook her head dismissively. "I don't care about that. Please move to your assigned seat in the back." Nathan felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had served his country for months, earning this moment of reprieve. And yet, here he was, being treated as if he didn't belong. Staying calm, he asked, "Could you please check with your supervisor?" His voice was firmer now, though still controlled. Without missing a beat, she snapped, "No. Just go to the back." The weight of her words settled heavily on Nathan. Though he had encountered rude individuals before, this felt deeply personal and unjust. Dressed in full uniform, he was being told to move to the back of the plane, despite having a valid ticket. Reluctantly, he turned and began walking toward the coach section. But something gnawed at him. The injustice of the situation, the empty first-class seats, the dismissive tone of the flight attendant. He stopped in his tracks, turned back, and approached her again. "Please, let me speak with your manager," he insisted, his voice resolute. The flight attendant's cold response didn't waver. "No," she said sharply, crossing her arms. Nathan's frustration bubbled beneath the surface. He had remained respectful throughout, yet he was being treated with blatant disregard. He realized that unless someone with authority intervened, this situation wouldn't change. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Nathan resolved to stand his ground. He had faced far more intense situations in his military career, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about respect. As the seconds passed, Nathan noticed the eyes of other passengers on him, their expressions ranging from curious to uncomfortable. Most remained silent, unwilling to speak up. The flight attendant, standing with her arms crossed, watched him coldly, offering no hint of apology or explanation. Nathan's sense of injustice grew with each passing moment. He knew he couldn't let this go, not when he had done nothing wrong. Determined, he prepared to escalate the issue further, setting the stage for an encounter that would not only challenge him, but also change the course of the airline's policies forever. Captain Nathan Reed sat in the cramped economy seat he had been relegated to, his mind racing with a mix of anger, confusion, and humiliation. The flight attendant's dismissal of his valid first-class ticket and her cold demeanor replayed in his mind like an unpleasant echo. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about what it represented. Respect was something Nathan had built his career on, and the blatant disregard for his service felt like a slap in the face. The cabin around him bustled with activity, but it barely registered. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks, yet all Nathan could think about was the injustice of it all. How could someone treat him this way? Especially when he had followed every rule and presented every credential to validate his claim. He had earned this seat, and her treatment of him as if he didn't belong gnawed at his composure. Taking a deep breath, Nathan clenched his fists. He wasn't someone who sought conflict, but he also wasn't someone who backed down from a fight, especially one that felt so fundamentally wrong. The plane's engines hummed steadily as he stood up, his resolve building. He wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. He wasn't looking for special treatment, just fairness. With his jaw set and his eyes focused, he made his way back to the front of the plane. The dismissive flight attendant noticed him immediately. Her expression hardened as she crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed by his persistence. She didn't say a word as Nathan approached, her silence an implicit challenge. "Where is the manager?" Nathan asked, his voice calm but firm. She offered no answer, turning her attention to a tray of drinks as if he were invisible. The audacity of her dismissal fueled Nathan's determination. He wasn't leaving until he spoke to someone with authority. For several tense moments he stood there, ignoring the quiet murmurs of nearby passengers. The pressure in the air was palpable, with eyes darting between him and the flight attendant, yet no one spoke up. Then, the door at the front of the plane opened, and a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform stepped aboard. Nathan felt a flicker of relief. The airline manager had arrived. His appearance was sharp, his demeanor calm, yet Nathan sensed a hesitancy in his measured strides. The flight attendant immediately stepped forward to speak with him in hushed tones, pointing in Nathan's direction. Nathan watched intently as the manager listened, his face neutral. For a moment their eyes met, and Nathan saw a glimmer of professionalism that gave him hope. But as the manager turned to approach him, there was a subtle shift, a flicker of doubt in his gaze that made Nathan wonder if he, too, would side with the flight attendant. "Is there a problem here, sir?" the manager asked, his tone polite but distant. Nathan steadied himself before responding. "Yes, there is. I was denied the first-class seat I was upgraded to through your military appreciation program. I have a valid ticket, and she told me the seat wasn't available. When I asked for clarification, she insisted I move to the back of the plane without explanation." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made clear he wasn't backing down. The manager glanced at the flight attendant, who stood stiffly to the side, arms crossed defensively. She didn't say a word, but her body language spoke volumes. The manager turned back to Nathan, his expression carefully neutral. "I see," he said finally. "Let me check on that for you." There was a smoothness to the manager's voice, but it carried an unsettling detachment. It made Nathan feel like he was being treated as a nuisance rather than a wronged customer. "Thank you," Nathan replied, keeping his tone even though his patience was wearing thin. The manager walked toward the cockpit, disappearing from sight, leaving Nathan standing in the aisle. The flight attendant returned to her tasks, her movements deliberate and cold. She avoided looking at him, but Nathan could feel her presence, a silent statement that she believed she had already won this battle. The minutes dragged on like hours. Nathan returned to his seat, but couldn't focus on anything else. The injustice of the situation replayed in his mind, each moment sharpening his frustration. Around him, passengers whispered quietly, casting furtive glances his way. Some seemed curious, others were visibly uncomfortable. Finally, the manager reappeared, striding down the aisle with a briskness that suggested urgency. But his expression had changed. It was more guarded, almost reluctant. Nathan straightened in his seat, ready for answers. "Captain Reed," the manager began, his voice now carrying a hint of formality. "I've looked into the matter. It seems there was a misunderstanding regarding your seat assignment." Nathan narrowed his eyes. "A misunderstanding? My ticket is valid, and the seat was empty. What's unclear about that?" The manager hesitated, glancing back at the flight attendant, who remained rigid and unrepentant. "It appears there was an error in our system," he explained, though his tone lacked conviction. "The seat was marked as unavailable, but I can assure you this will be reviewed thoroughly after the flight." Nathan didn't buy it. He knew an excuse when he heard one, and the manager's explanation didn't add up. The seat was empty. The only thing standing between him and it was the flight attendant's attitude. "This isn't just about a system error," Nathan said, his voice steady but firm. "This is about the way I was treated. I followed the process, presented my ticket, and was dismissed without reason." The manager shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Nathan could feel the weight of the moment settling over the cabin. Passengers around him sat silently, watching the exchange with bated breath. Finally, the manager cleared his throat. "Captain Reed, I'll ensure this matter is addressed appropriately. For now, I'd appreciate your patience while we continue the flight." Nathan held his gaze, unflinching. He had heard empty promises before and wasn't about to accept another one. Still, he nodded, deciding to see how the airline would handle the situation. As the manager walked away, Nathan settled back into his seat. The tension in the air remained, but Nathan's resolve only grew. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for respect. And if the airline thought they could sweep this under the rug, they were sorely mistaken. Captain Nathan Reed watched intently as the manager returned, this time accompanied by a woman whose sharp suit and confident stride exuded authority. She moved with purpose, her piercing gaze scanning the scene as if assessing every detail. Nathan sat straighter, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just another routine complaint anymore. Things were getting serious. The manager, whose demeanor now lacked the dismissive tone from earlier, cleared his throat and addressed Nathan. "Captain Reed, I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience," he began, his words carefully measured. Yet there was something rehearsed in his tone that immediately put Nathan on edge. "I've spoken with the flight attendant," the manager continued, "and I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Nathan's frustration flared. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice calm but simmering with controlled anger. "How is it a misunderstanding when she refused to let me sit in the seat I was upgraded to? I have my military ID and a first-class ticket. What exactly is unclear about that?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, a slight hesitation betraying his unease. Before he could respond, the supervisor, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Her voice, firm and authoritative, immediately commanded attention. "Captain Reed," she began, her tone carrying a sense of professionalism Nathan hadn't yet encountered during this ordeal. "Let me assure you that we take these matters very seriously. Our policies are designed to ensure all passengers are treated with respect, regardless of their background or status." Her words gave Nathan a sliver of hope. She didn't seem like someone who tolerated excuses. However, her next statement sent a wave of disbelief through him. "Unfortunately," she continued, "our military program does not guarantee first-class upgrades in every instance. What you were told earlier may have been a miscommunication." "Miscommunication?" Nathan said, his frustration boiling over. "Are you telling me I'm just supposed to accept that I was lied to? I've flown with your airline before and been upgraded without issue. This isn't about a program. It's about basic respect." The supervisor's expression remained composed, but the manager visibly squirmed, clearly unprepared for this level of confrontation. "Sir," the manager interjected cautiously, "we are doing our best to resolve this issue. I've reviewed your ticket, and I can confirm that your upgrade was indeed legitimate. However, there appears to have been a mix-up in the seat assignment." He hesitated, then added, "The seat was available, but there was some confusion in our system." Nathan's jaw tightened. The seat was empty, the flight was far from full, and if there had been a legitimate issue, someone should have explained it to him. Instead, he had been dismissed and humiliated. Now, they were trying to paint this as a technical error, as if that justified the flight attendant's behavior. "This isn't about a mix-up," Nathan said firmly. "It's about how I was treated. No one explained anything to me. I was told to move the back of the plane without so much as a proper reason. That's not a mix-up. That's blatant disrespect." The supervisor nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. She glanced toward the flight attendant, who stood a few paces away, arms tightly crossed and gaze fixed on the ground. "I understand your frustration, Captain," the supervisor said, her tone softening just enough to acknowledge his feelings. "I do apologize for how this has been handled. However, I assure you that this matter will be addressed in the proper way. Nathan followed her gaze to the flight attendant. She hadn't spoken since the manager's arrival, but her tense posture and defensive stance spoke volumes. Her behavior during the incident had been dismissive and cold, and now she seemed to be bracing for the fallout. The supervisor turned to the manager and leaned in, whispering something too quiet for Nathan to hear. The manager nodded and took a step back, his posture shifting as if awaiting further instructions. Nathan could feel the atmosphere change. The balance of power seemed to shift as the supervisor took full control of the situation. She approached the flight attendant with deliberate steps. Though her voice was calm, there was a steeliness in her demeanor that left no room for misinterpretation. The attendant stiffened, her hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of her uniform. Nathan couldn't hear their exchange, but the flight attendant's reaction said it all. Her initial defensiveness gave way to a fleeting look of indignation before she masked it with a forced neutrality. The supervisor, unmoved, continued speaking with quiet authority. Moments later, the supervisor returned to Nathan, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Captain Reed, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said. "We are conducting a full review of this matter, and appropriate actions will be taken regarding the conduct of our staff." Nathan nodded slowly, processing her words. "And what does appropriate action mean?" he asked, his tone even but firm. "Because I'm not interested in a vague promise. I want accountability." The supervisor didn't flinch. "You have my word, Captain, that this will not be swept under the rug. We will follow through." The flight attendant, now standing silently to the side, avoided eye contact. Nathan could sense her unease, but he felt no sympathy. Her actions had escalated this situation unnecessarily, and she needed to face the consequences. As the tension in the cabin began to ease, Nathan felt a small but significant shift in his own emotions. While he wasn't fully satisfied, he could see that the supervisor was taking the situation seriously. The resolution wasn't complete, but it was a start. The supervisor's firm stance and decisive handling of the situation gave Nathan hope that this wasn't just another corporate cover-up. Still, he knew he would have to remain vigilant. Accountability, after all, required persistence. For now, though, he allowed himself to lean back in his seat, his resolve as steady as ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since boarding the plane, Nathan felt like someone was finally listening. The air felt heavy as Captain Nathan Reed stood near the front of the plane, watching the interaction between the supervisor and the flight attendant. The manager lingered a few steps behind them, his watchful eyes betraying a hint of unease. Nathan couldn't hear what was being said, but the flight attendant's body language told its own story. Her posture, once defensive, had stiffened further. Her hands, which had been fidgeting with the hem of her uniform, were now clenched tightly at her sides. As the supervisor spoke, her calm but commanding tone seemed to strike a nerve. For a brief moment, a flash of anger crossed the flight attendant's face, but she quickly masked it with a strained, artificial smile. The supervisor turned back to Nathan, her expression measured yet serious. "Captain Reed," she began, offering a tight-lipped smile that felt more like protocol than genuine reassurance, "we've spoken with the flight attendant and have addressed the situation internally. This matter will be reviewed further after the flight." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a recognition that this was no simple misunderstanding. Nathan felt the weight of her words, but he wasn't satisfied. A review sounded like corporate jargon for sweeping the issue under the rug. He folded his arms, his gaze steady. "What do you mean by review? Are you just gonna let her get away with this?" His voice was sharper now, the frustration he had held back bubbling to the surface. The manager, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Captain Reed, I assure you this will be taken seriously," he said, his tone measured yet tinged with unease. "We will look into the flight attendant's actions, and I will personally ensure proper steps are taken." Nathan locked eyes with the manager, unconvinced. "And what happens to her?" he pressed. "Does she just go back to her job like nothing happened after causing all this trouble?" The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the supervisor cut him off, her voice firm and unyielding. "No, Captain. We take these matters very seriously. she said. Her conduct will be reviewed, and if the investigation finds her actions were out of line, there will be consequences. This was the first time Nathan felt a crack in the wall of corporate deflection. The supervisor's words, though carefully measured, acknowledged that the flight attendant's behavior might have been more than just a mistake. Nathan's eyes narrowed. He had heard promises like this before, empty assurances designed to pacify the wronged party without leading to real change. Still, the supervisor's directness gave him a glimmer of hope that something tangible might come of this. As he processed her words, he glanced at the flight attendant, who remained off to the side. Her silence was deafening. She hadn't apologized, hadn't offered a single word of explanation. Instead, she stood stiffly, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the ground. She seemed more concerned with maintaining her composure than taking responsibility for her actions. Nathan couldn't help but wonder if she even understood the seriousness of the situation. Her lack of accountability had turned what might have been a minor misunderstanding into a full-blown conflict. The supervisor's voice broke his thoughts. "Captain Reed, I understand your frustration," she said, her tone softer but still professional. "We will ensure this situation is handled appropriately. Thank you for your patience." Nathan stood there for a moment, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, relief, and skepticism. He wasn't feeling victorious, not yet, but there was a shift in the air, a sense that the issue wasn't being entirely ignored. The flight attendant's actions had been called out, and she wasn't walking away unscathed. Still, Nathan wasn't about to let this end on a vague promise. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'll be expecting an update." The supervisor nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Captain. We will follow up with you as soon as the review is complete." Nathan could tell she wasn't making any promises she couldn't keep, but her lack of specifics left him uneasy. He wasn't naive enough to think the matter would be resolved quickly or cleanly. The wheels of corporate accountability turned slowly, and he knew it would take persistence to ensure this wasn't brushed aside. As the conversation came to a close, the supervisor turned away, signaling the end of their interaction. Nathan felt a mix of emotions, relief that the issue was being taken seriously, but also lingering anger that it had taken this long to get to this point. He glanced at the flight attendant one last time. She hadn't once met his gaze, hadn't offered so much as a token apology. Her silence spoke volumes, and Nathan couldn't decide if it stemmed from pride, fear, or a refusal to admit her mistake. As he returned to his seat, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Passengers continued to cast furtive glances his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Nathan could feel the weight of their unspoken thoughts, but he ignored them, focusing instead on what needed to happen next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The situation had begun to unfold in ways Nathan couldn't yet predict, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let it fade into obscurity. Someone needed to be held accountable, and Nathan would ensure the matter wasn't forgotten the moment the plane touched down. As he leaned back in his seat, he couldn't help but feel the tension brewing beneath the surface. This was more than just a personal grievance. It was about respect, professionalism, and ensuring that no one else had to endure the same treatment. The wheels had been set in motion, and Nathan had a distinct feeling that the outcome would ripple far beyond this single flight. Captain Nathan Reed returned to his seat, the tension around him as thick as the air in the cabin. His thoughts raced uncontrollably, replaying every detail of the earlier confrontation. The flight attendant's refusal to acknowledge his valid first-class ticket and her dismissive attitude burned in his mind. It wasn't about the seat anymore, it was about respect. Nathan leaned back, attempting to calm himself, but every time he closed his eyes, the humiliation of the encounter came rushing back. He had approached her politely, explained the situation calmly, and yet he had been dismissed outright, treated as if his service and his dignity meant nothing. The weight of her actions cut deeper than he expected. He had dedicated his career to earning respect, not just for himself, but for his country. Now, sitting in a cramped economy seat he didn't belong in, that respect felt stolen from him. A few minutes later, one of the cabin crew walked down the aisle, offering drinks. It was the same flight attendant who had started all this. She didn't make eye contact with him, her movements stiff and awkward. She handed a drink to the passenger beside him and moved on quickly, as though avoiding him entirely. Nathan sighed, leaning against the window. The unease in her posture was palpable, but it didn't feel like remorse. It felt more like fear of further confrontation. He wasn't interested in making a scene. All he wanted was accountability. The minutes dragged on, but no one came to check on him, let alone offer an apology. The cabin crew went about their duties as though nothing had happened, their routines almost unnervingly normal. Nathan glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw the flight attendant standing by the galley, chatting with another crew member. From a distance, she seemed relaxed, but Nathan noticed subtle cues. The way her hands rested tensely on her hips, the way her gaze flicked nervously toward the passengers. She wasn't as composed as she pretended to be. Still, there was no acknowledgement of her actions, no indication that she understood the gravity of what she had done. Nathan had seen enough in his career to recognize when something was being swept under the rug. This felt like one of those moments. The airline's strategy seemed clear. Let the flight continue as if nothing had happened, hope the passengers forgot, and move on. But Nathan wasn't the type to let things slide. As the plane hummed steadily, Nathan stared out the window, the soft roar of the engines doing little to quiet his mind. His thoughts circled back to the same questions. How could someone in her position act so unprofessionally? Why had no one intervened sooner? And most importantly, what was the airline going to do about it? It wasn't until the plane began its descent that the dynamic shifted again. The seatbelt sign came on and the cabin lights dimmed, signaling they were nearing their destination. Nathan's focus broke as the same flight attendant approached his seat. This time, she didn't speak. She stood there awkwardly, waiting for him to fasten his seatbelt, her presence a mix of tension and discomfort. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, nervous energy. Nathan stared at her for a moment, debating whether to say something. There were so many things he wanted to express. Frustration, disappointment, even pity. But he held back. Words wouldn't change anything now. Instead, he simply nodded and complied, fastening his seatbelt. The flight attendant moved on quickly, and Nathan was left wondering what was next. When the plane landed and taxied to the gate, the tension in the cabin lingered. Passengers began gathering their belongings, and Nathan stood, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. His eyes remained fixed on the flight attendant, who busied herself helping others with their luggage. There was no sign of remorse in her actions, no effort to acknowledge what had transpired. To her, it seemed the incident was already in the past, a fleeting inconvenience she could ignore. But for Nathan, it was far from over. As the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling the end of the flight, Nathan made his way toward the exit. Near the door, he spotted the supervisor standing by the gate, speaking with another crew member. Their eyes met, and for the first time that day, Nathan felt a flicker of something resembling accountability. The supervisor's expression was serious, her gaze steady. She didn't avoid his eyes, and that alone set her apart from the rest of the crew. Yet, Nathan couldn't shake the lingering frustration. Was this the beginning of real action, or just another step in a corporate dance to deflect responsibility? As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Nathan felt a strange mix of relief and dissatisfaction. The ordeal was over for now, but the weight of it clung to him. He moved through the crowd of passengers, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, because the confrontation was behind him. Frustration, because the resolution still felt so far away. This wasn't something he could brush aside. Too often, situations like this were forgotten, lost in the shuffle of daily life. But Nathan couldn't let that happen. Not this time. He deserved respect, and more importantly, he needed to ensure no one else endured the same treatment. The wheels of accountability had started to turn, slow as they might be. Nathan only hoped they would carry him, and the truth, far enough to make a real difference. Captain Nathan Reed left the plane with a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Frustration, determination, and an unrelenting sense that something had to change. The supervisor's promises of a review sounded hollow, the kind of corporate speak Nathan had encountered before, designed to pacify rather than solve. He knew this couldn't become just another case of empty assurances and forgotten complaints. As he arrived at baggage claim, Nathan retrieved his bag from the conveyor belt and paused. The crowd bustled around him, travelers rushing to their next destination, their lives unaffected by the injustice he had just endured. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had experienced similar treatment, dismissed, humiliated, and left without answers. The flight attendant's actions weren't a one-time mistake. They had been deliberate. Her attitude represented something deeper, an ingrained disregard for those who served, for those like Nathan who had given so much. He couldn't remain silent. He wouldn't. Stepping out into the crisp evening air, Nathan pulled out his phone. He quickly searched for the airline's customer service number, determined to demand accountability. Before he could dial, a notification buzzed. The subject line of the email caught his attention immediately. Important update regarding your recent experience with Airhaven. Nathan opened the message cautiously. The email began with the kind of generic apology he had expected. We regret that your recent experience did not meet our standards of service. But as he continued reading, the tone shifted. The airline acknowledged the incident and stated that they had taken immediate action to address it internally. The final line stood out. As a result of this incident, the flight attendant involved has been suspended pending further review. Nathan froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. Suspended. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a full resolution, but it was something. It was a start, an acknowledgement that what had happened was serious enough to warrant immediate consequences. He sat on a nearby bench, staring at the email as he processed the news. The suspension gave him a glimmer of hope that this wouldn't be brushed aside. However, the words "pending further review" lingered in his mind. It was a reminder that the suspension was temporary, that the airline could still reinstate her quietly if they deemed the matter insignificant. Nathan took a deep breath and pressed the call button. He wasn't going to leave this to chance. The hold music played as he waited, his mind replaying every moment of the incident. The flight attendant's dismissive tone, the manager's hesitant responses, and the supervisor's promises. This wasn't just about a first-class seat anymore. It was about demanding respect and ensuring that no one else had to endure what he had. Finally, a voice came through the line. Thank you for calling Airhaven customer service. How can I assist you today? Nathan began calmly recounting his experience, detailing the sequence of events without exaggeration. He spoke of how he had been treated, the flight attendant's refusal to honor his ticket, and the lack of immediate accountability from the airline staff. The representative listened without interruption, their tone professional yet sincere. When Nathan finished, there was a pause before the response came. I sincerely apologize, Captain Reed. We take these matters very seriously, and I'll make sure this is escalated to the appropriate team for further investigation. Nathan wasn't entirely convinced. The apology felt genuine, but he knew too well how easily complaints could be lost in bureaucracy. It's important to me, he said firmly, that the airline holds the flight attendant accountable for her actions. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of disrespect. I need assurance that this will be addressed properly. I understand, sir, the representative replied. We're committed to following through on this. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. As the call ended, Nathan leaned back on the bench, his thoughts still racing. The email and the call were steps in the right direction. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Accountability required persistence, and he was prepared to see it through. For the first time since the ordeal began, Nathan felt a small sense of control. The wheels of accountability were in motion, slow and uncertain though they might be. This wasn't just about his own experience. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring that the airline, and others like it, treated all passengers with the respect they deserved. As he stood to leave, Nathan glanced at his phone one last time. The email still sat open, the words suspended pending further review staring back at him. It wasn't victory, but it was progress. Walking through the terminal, Nathan resolved that this was far from the end. He wasn't going to let the matter fade into obscurity. He had been disrespected, but he wasn't going to let that define the story. This wasn't just about getting answers. It was about ensuring change. The airline had made the first move. Now it was Nathan's turn to make sure they followed through. Captain Nathan Reed was resolute. The fight wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. This time, he wouldn't let it be forgotten. In the days following the incident, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by a simmering frustration that lingered in the back of his mind. Nathan had done everything he could to push the airline for answers, but now he found himself in a frustrating limbo, waiting for updates. Every time his phone buzzed, he grabbed it quickly, hoping for news. But the only responses he received were generic emails, automated messages, and the occasional vague assurance that the investigation was still ongoing. It could be days, weeks, or even months before he got real closure. The uncertainty only fueled his frustration. The more Nathan thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a systemic issue. The flight attendant's blatant disregard for his status as a service member wasn't an isolated incident. It reflected something deeper, a culture that allowed such behavior to exist unchecked. Nathan wasn't alone. He knew there were others, soldiers, veterans, and countless passengers who had experienced similar mistreatment but hadn't spoken up. It wasn't just about his uniform or his first-class ticket. It was about respect and dignity. That knowledge drove him to keep pushing, not just for himself, but for anyone who might face the same injustice. A week later, a new email arrived from Airlines. This one was different. The subject line read, "Final update, resolution of your recent incident." Nathan hesitated for a moment before opening it, his heart pounding. The email began with another apology, but this time, it was more specific. It detailed the steps the airline had taken to address the situation. The email explained that after a thorough investigation, including interviews with passengers and crew members, the airline had decided to terminate the flight attendant's employment, effective immediately. Nathan stared at the screen, processing the words. Terminated. The decision was decisive, and for the first time, he felt a sense of relief. The airline had taken action. The flight attendant would no longer be able to treat anyone the way she had treated him. But alongside the relief came unease. The consequences were severe. A lost job, a tarnished reputation, all because of a single interaction. Nathan didn't take satisfaction in someone losing their livelihood, but he also knew that her actions had crossed a line. There was no going back from that. Still, it felt like a victory, even if it came at a high cost. Nathan had fought for respect and forced the airline to confront its flaws. It could no longer hide behind corporate language and empty promises. They had been compelled to make a tough decision, and that was something Nathan could live with. A few days later, Nathan received a personal phone call from the airline's customer relations manager. It was the first time someone from the company had reached out directly. "Captain Reed, I want to thank you for your patience throughout this process," the manager began. His tone was sincere, and for the first time, Nathan felt like someone at the airline genuinely cared about making things right. The manager reiterated the company's commitment to providing a better experience for all passengers and apologized for how the situation had been handled. As a gesture of goodwill, he offered Nathan a complimentary round-trip flight. Nathan wasn't sure how to respond. He appreciated the gesture, but free flights weren't what he had been fighting for. He wanted accountability, and in some way, he had gotten that. The sincerity in the manager's voice gave Nathan hope. It wasn't the flight voucher that mattered. It was the fact that the airline had finally done the right thing. As the call ended, Nathan put down his phone and sat in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From the moment he stepped onto that plane, to the anger and frustration of being dismissed, to the persistence it took to see the matter through, it had been exhausting. But in the end, he had made a difference. Nathan looked out the window, watching the sun set over the horizon. The world outside seemed quiet, peaceful, but he knew that things had changed. Not just for him, but for the airline, the flight attendant, and anyone who might face disrespect in the future. The fight wasn't over, not completely, but this was a step forward, and for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, Nathan continued to reflect on the experience. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. By standing up for himself, he had set a precedent. The airline had been forced to take responsibility, and the changes they made would ripple beyond this one incident. Nathan knew he had spoken not just for himself, but for the many others who might never have had the chance to raise their voices. And that, above all, was what made it all worthwhile. Captain Nathan Reed couldn't shake the feeling that the incident had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. At first, it had seemed like a fight over a seat, a frustrating but isolated confrontation. But as the days passed and he reflected on everything that had happened, he realized it was about something much bigger. Standing up for respect, accountability, and the principle that every individual deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their rank, appearance, or background. The waiting had been the hardest part. Days of back-and-forth emails and vague reassurances from customer service often felt like a deliberate distraction, a way for the airline to delay resolution while hoping the issue would fade away. Nathan had seen it before, businesses putting on a facade of concern but ultimately doing nothing to address the real problem. And yet, the final email confirming the flight attendant's termination had been a turning point. It wasn't an easy outcome to process. Someone had lost their job over an incident that began as a misunderstanding, but Nathan knew it hadn't been just a misunderstanding. Her behavior, her refusal to listen, her dismissive attitude was unacceptable. The decision to terminate her employment wasn't just about punishing one person. It was a sign that the airline had been forced to confront the deeper issues in its culture. It was a win, but it came with a sense of unease. Nathan wondered how many other flight attendants or staff members had acted similarly in small, unnoticed ways. How many passengers had been treated poorly but had remained silent, unsure of how to push back, or too disheartened to try. The personal call from the airline's customer relations manager had been another step forward. The manager's apology felt genuine, but Nathan couldn't ignore the underlying motivation to close the case quickly and move on. Offering him a free round-trip flight was a kind gesture, but it wasn't what Nathan wanted. He didn't care about vouchers or Goodwill credits. He wanted to ensure no one else would experience the same treatment. For much of his life, Nathan had been quiet and reserved, content to do his work and avoid making waves. He had always believed in staying focused on his responsibilities and letting the bigger problems sort themselves out. But this experience had opened his eyes to a truth he could no longer ignore. Sometimes you have to speak up. Sometimes you have to make noise. It wasn't easy to push back against a large corporation, to persist in the face of vague promises and bureaucratic delays. But in doing so, Nathan had forced change, not just for himself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Even after the flight attendant's termination and the airline's apology, Nathan knew the story wasn't over. The real question lingered. How would the airline ensure this didn't happen again? Was the issue limited to one employee, or did it reflect a deeper problem within the company's culture? Nathan didn't have all the answers, but he knew this much. The fight wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about pushing for systemic change, about forcing the airline, and perhaps others in the industry, to take a hard look at how they treated their customers, especially those who served in the military. He thought back to the other passengers on the flight. Had any of them noticed what had happened? Had they seen the way the flight attendant dismissed him, the disdain in her voice and actions? Likely, most of them hadn't given it much thought. After all, it wasn't the kind of incident that usually drew attention. But Nathan realized that even though he had felt alone in that moment, he wasn't. Countless others had likely experienced similar situations, moments of being overlooked or disrespected. Maybe they hadn't said anything. Maybe they hadn't made a big deal out of it. But that didn't mean they hadn't noticed. Nathan realized something profound. Silence didn't mean people didn't care. It often meant they were waiting for someone else to take the first step, someone to say this isn't right and demand accountability. That was where he came in. By standing up for himself, Nathan had given others permission to do the same. He didn't know how this story would end, but he knew he had started a conversation that needed to happen. This wasn't just about a single flight or a single airline anymore. It was about changing the culture, one small step at a time. And for Nathan, that was the first step in creating a world where respect and dignity weren't optional, but a given. In the weeks following the incident, Captain Nathan Reed refused to let the matter rest. He continued to follow up with Airhaven Airlines, holding them to their promises, and ensuring that their commitment to change wasn't just lip service. Nathan made it clear in every email and phone call. He wasn't going away until he saw the full picture. He wasn't just another disgruntled passenger looking for a quick fix. He wanted accountability. He wanted systemic change. Each time he reached out, the airline responded with assurances that they were working on it. But Nathan wasn't about to let them off the hook. Patient but persistent, he pressed on, determined to ensure that no one else, especially those who had earned their place through service, would have to experience the kind of disrespect he had endured. This fight wasn't just about one flight attendant anymore. It was about something much larger. As days turned into weeks, the weight of what had happened began to settle into Nathan's mind. At times, the confrontation, the emails, and the phone calls felt like a distant memory. Yet in other ways, it remained vivid and alive, shaping his perspective in ways he hadn't anticipated. Nathan had expected a standard resolution, a quiet apology, a perfunctory acknowledgement. Instead, what he experienced had become a turning point in his life. Throughout his military career, Nathan had been a man of quiet discipline. He handled problems himself, rarely raising his voice or making a fuss. If something couldn't be fixed, he moved on. But the incident on that flight pushed him into unfamiliar territory. It wasn't just about his seat. It was about his dignity, his service, and ultimately, the respect he deserved, not just as a soldier, but as a human being. While the airline had been cooperative to an extent, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were only doing the bare minimum to resolve the situation. The flight attendant had been fired and they had promised future improvements, but Nathan had seen how easily corporations could spin a situation, apply a superficial fix, and move on without addressing the root cause. Not this time. Nathan kept pushing. He sent follow-up emails asking for more details about the investigation. He pressed for specifics on the steps the airline was taking to prevent similar incidents in the future. He inquired about their training processes for employees, how they handled complaints, and how they planned to foster a culture of respect for all passengers, especially those in the military. Relentless in his pursuit, Nathan knew that if he didn't keep the pressure on, nothing would change. Then, one day, he received an unexpected call. It was the customer relations manager again, but this time, the tone was different. Gone were the vague reassurances and corporate platitudes. Instead, the manager spoke to Nathan as an equal, someone genuinely invested in making things right. "Captain Reed," the manager began, "I want to thank you for your persistence. We've been listening to your feedback, and I'm happy to share that we've decided to implement a company-wide training initiative focused on diversity, respect, and military appreciation." Nathan was momentarily stunned. He had expected more polite deflection, but this was something else entirely. The manager explained that following the incident, the airline had conducted a full review of its staff training programs. They had identified gaps in how employees interacted with military personnel and other customers deserving of specific considerations. In response, they planned to roll out new training for all flight attendants and customer service staff. The focus of the training would include cultural sensitivity, understanding the unique needs of military members, and fostering a greater sense of respect and professionalism in all interactions. For the first time in weeks, Nathan felt a flicker of hope. He had fought for change, and now it seemed to be happening. "This isn't just about one incident," the manager continued. "We're also establishing a dedicated support line for military personnel to report concerns during their travels. Soldiers, veterans, and their families will have a direct way to voice their issues without fear of being ignored." Nathan felt the weight of those words. This wasn't a token gesture. It was a real, meaningful step toward making things right. The airline wasn't just apologizing anymore. They were taking action to ensure that respect wasn't an exception, but a standard. For the first time, Nathan felt like his voice had been heard. As the conversation ended, Nathan put down the phone, his thoughts racing. The changes the airline promised wouldn't just benefit him, they would help countless others. This was about more than one flight or one airline. It was about creating a culture where respect was the norm, not the exception. Nathan looked out the window, a small smile forming. The fight wasn't over, but it was moving in the right direction. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or disrespected. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step toward something much larger. Captain Nathan Reed sat in stunned disbelief as the phone call ended with an invitation to meet with Airline's senior leadership team. They wanted his input, his perspective, to help guide meaningful changes within their company. It felt surreal. A major corporation was not only acknowledging his experience, but actively seeking his advice. As the day of the meeting approached, Nathan reflected on the unexpected journey that had led him here. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been a passenger on a flight, frustrated and humiliated, doing his best to get home after a long deployment. Now, he was on the cusp of influencing how one of the largest airlines in the country approached respect, accountability, and customer service. It wasn't a path he had ever imagined for himself, but it one he had embraced with determination and persistence. On the morning of the meeting, Nathan donned his military uniform, feeling the weight of his years of service settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone he represented. Fellow soldiers, veterans, and all who had been overlooked or disrespected. When he walked into the airline's corporate headquarters, he was greeted by a small group of executives. They looked attentive, eager even, and their apologies felt different this time. They weren't going through the motions. They were there to listen. For the next few hours, Nathan shared his story in detail, describing the events that had led to this moment and the impact they had on him. He explained how the lack of respect he experienced was more than a one-time mistake. It was a symptom of a deeper cultural problem. He offered actionable suggestions. "It's not just about grand gestures," Nathan said, his voice calm but firm. "Small acts of respect, acknowledging someone's service with a smile or a thank you, can make a world of difference. But it can't stop there. Military appreciation shouldn't be an afterthought. It needs to be part of your company's culture, embedded in everything you do, from training to customer interactions." The executives nodded, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. They weren't defensive or dismissive. They seemed genuinely invested in understanding what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. By the end of the meeting, Nathan felt something he hadn't expected. Satisfaction. The company was listening, not just to him, but to the larger message his experience represented. They asked if he would stay involved, helping to ensure the commitments they made would be more than just words. Nathan agreed. He didn't want to be a footnote in their story. He wanted to make sure the story continued to be written in a way that mattered for years to come. As Nathan left the headquarters, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. The road to this moment had been filled with frustration, doubt, and a relentless push for accountability. But in the end, his persistence had paid off. The airline wasn't just apologizing. They were taking action. More importantly, Nathan had learned something about himself. Standing up for what's right takes more than words. It takes patience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to see things through, even when the odds seem stacked against you. What had started as a personal fight for respect had grown into something much bigger. Nathan had helped set a new standard, one where respect was no longer optional, where everyone, regardless of their background, could count on being treated with dignity. In the weeks following the meeting, Nathan reflected on how much his life had changed. A confrontation over a first-class seat had spiraled into a campaign for change, not just within the airline, but within society's broader treatment of military personnel. Through his years of service, Nathan had come to understand the power of discipline and respect. But this experience had opened his eyes to the challenges of translating those values into civilian spaces, airlines, hotels, retail businesses, where subtle forms of disrespect often went unnoticed. It wasn't always about dramatic incidents like being denied a seat. Often it was the smaller moments, the dismissive tone, the lack of acknowledgement that made service members feel less than, as though their sacrifices weren't valued. The tangible actions the airline began taking after their meeting proved that change was possible when people stood up and demanded it. One afternoon, about a month later, Nathan received another email from the airline. This time, it wasn't a corporate apology or an update on policy changes. It was something more personal, a genuine invitation to help shape the future. The email detailed the company's next steps. 1. A company-wide initiative to educate employees on cultural sensitivity and military appreciation. 2. A plan to partner with veterans organizations to ensure their policies aligned with the needs of service members. 3. A dedicated support line for soldiers, veterans, and their families to report issues without fear of being ignored. Nathan felt a swell of pride. His actions had sparked a ripple effect that would help change how businesses interacted with the military community. For the first time since the incident, Nathan felt at peace. This wasn't just about one seat on one flight. It was about creating a culture of respect that would last for generations. He knew the work wasn't over, but he also knew that standing up for what's right had been worth every moment of frustration. What had begun as a deeply personal fight had transformed into a broader movement for dignity and respect. And for Nathan, that was a victory worth celebrating. Captain Nathan Reed received an unexpected invitation to participate in a focus group organized by Airlines. The group's purpose was clear: to shape the future of their military appreciation policies. The email acknowledged the progress they had already made in response to his feedback, but emphasized their desire to do even better. It wasn't just a hollow gesture. The airline was actively seeking Nathan's input, showing a commitment to real, lasting change. As Nathan read the invitation, he felt a mix of emotions. He appreciated the opportunity, but couldn't help wondering if this was just another corporate exercise in box ticking. Still, he understood that meaningful change often required time and continuous effort. The fact that the airline was still reaching out for feedback was a positive sign. When the day of the focus group arrived, Nathan found himself seated in a conference room alongside several other veterans. They came from different military branches and walks of life, each bringing their own story of service and mistreatment during their travels. As the meeting began, the veterans shared their experiences. Some spoke of being denied upgrades despite valid tickets. Others recounted being ignored by customer service staff, and many detailed instances of subtle biases or stereotypes. Nathan listened intently, and what struck him most was how similar their stories were to his own. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, systemic issue. For Nathan, the focus group became more than a meeting. It was a cathartic experience, a chance to connect with others who had faced the same struggles and to realize that his fight wasn't just personal, it was part of a broader, collective movement. Over the course of several hours, the veterans and airline executives engaged in an open and honest dialogue. The executives took notes, asked questions, and even admitted to their previous lack of understanding about the unique challenges faced by military personnel. The turning point came when the group was asked for concrete suggestions on how to improve the airline's service. Nathan spoke up, his voice steady but impassioned. "You need to make it easy for military personnel to get the help they need," he began. "Create a dedicated support line so soldiers, veterans, and their families can contact customer service quickly and directly without having to explain their situation over and over." He continued, suggesting the airline strengthen its partnerships with veterans organizations to ensure its policies aligned with the real needs of the military community. But his most important point was simple: treat every soldier, every veteran, like they matter, because they do. Respect can't just be a policy. It has to be part of your culture. It's not enough to write a program. It's the people who matter. When a flight attendant walks down the aisle and sees someone in uniform, they shouldn't just feel a sense of duty. They should feel pride. That respect has to come from the top down, and it has to be felt at every level of the company. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Nathan's words hanging in the air. The executives nodded, their expressions thoughtful. As the meeting wound down, the airline leaders thanked the veterans for their time and feedback. For Nathan, the experience left him with a sense of accomplishment. not for himself, but for the people who would follow him. The changes the airline was working on weren't just about accommodating military personnel. They were about creating a cultural shift. It wasn't just about addressing past mistakes. It was about recognizing the sacrifices service members made and ensuring they felt respected and valued every step of the way. Later that week, Airhaven Airlines made a public announcement about the new policies they were implementing. This wasn't just another press release. It was a commitment to change, backed by tangible actions and initiatives to be rolled out over the coming months. The airline had partnered with prominent veterans organizations to launch a nationwide awareness campaign on the importance of treating military personnel with respect and dignity. They also introduced a new Veterans Priority Program, which offered active duty soldiers and veterans access to priority seating, early boarding, a dedicated customer service line. For Nathan, the campaign was the culmination of everything he had fought for. It wasn't about one flight or one flight attendant. It was about ensuring that no soldier would ever have to feel the way he had felt on that fateful flight. The real change wasn't just in the airline's policies. It was in the mindset of the people who worked there. They were starting to see military personnel not as a special case, but as valued members of society who deserved the same respect as any other customer. As Nathan sat back and reflected on how far things had come, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he believed that progress was possible. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a step forward for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected. And that made it all worthwhile. Captain Nathan Reed reflected on the transformation that had unfolded since his initial complaint. What began as a single act of standing up for himself had grown into a larger movement, one that was beginning to leave a lasting mark, not just on Airhaven Airlines, but across industries. The changes were happening, slowly but surely, and Nathan could see the tangible results. The airline's new military appreciation program was gaining traction. Veterans and active duty personnel traveling with Airhaven started to notice the difference: priority boarding, respectful interactions, and a genuine effort to accommodate their needs. Nathan stayed connected with the airline, frequently checking on their progress, offering his insights, and participating in additional focus groups. It became clear to Nathan that the company wasn't just making surface-level changes. They were committed to a cultural shift. And it wasn't just the airline. Other companies had taken notice of what Airhaven was doing. Nathan began receiving calls and emails from organizations across different industries, asking for his advice on how to improve their policies for military personnel. It was a ripple effect Nathan hadn't expected. What had started as one man's frustration over being treated unfairly had turned into a larger movement for respect, appreciation, and accountability for those who served. Change, Nathan knew, was never instantaneous. It took time for policies to evolve into deeply ingrained practices, but the momentum was undeniable. Airlines, businesses, and individuals were beginning to see the importance of respecting military personnel, not as a token gesture, but as a foundational part of their culture. Nathan could already imagine the stories. Soldiers walking into airports and being greeted with a genuine smile, veterans getting upgraded seats without needing to ask, military families traveling without having to fight for basic amenities. It wasn't the grand gestures that meant the most, it was the little things. Those small victories were adding up, and Nathan took quiet pride in knowing he had played a part in making them possible. The work, of course, was far from finished. There were always more ways to improve, more people to reach, and more businesses to inspire. But the progress was unmistakable. Nathan began to notice the subtle shifts every time he walked through an airport. Flight attendants smiled and greeted service members with respect. Soldiers in uniform seemed to move through the terminals with a quiet confidence. Their presence met with appreciation rather than indifference. One day, as Nathan stood at the gate for another flight, he found himself looking around at the passengers waiting to board. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. This wasn't the world he had grown up in, a world where soldiers like him were often overlooked or dismissed. This was a world where respect was becoming the baseline. Companies like Airlines were recognizing the sacrifices made by those who served and treating them with the dignity they deserved. Nathan wasn't just a soldier anymore. He had become a catalyst for change, someone who had identified a problem, fought for a solution, and in the process, helped make the world a little better. The feeling of having made a difference was something that would stay with him long after the story faded from the headlines. In the quieter days after the resolution, Nathan returned to his routine. He resumed the work and life that had defined him before the incident, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. His actions, no matter how small they had seemed at the time, had created a ripple that continued to grow. The respect denied to him, and to so many others like him, was slowly but surely being restored. Not just by the airline, but by the broader corporate world and perhaps society at large. Nathan never expected to be the face of a movement. Fame or recognition was never his goal. What mattered to him were the small, quiet victories, the moments when soldiers, veterans, and their families felt seen, valued, and respected. It wasn't about accolades or praise. It was about making sure that no one who served their country would ever feel dismissed or diminished again. Nathan knew that this fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but the progress they had achieved was undeniable. His story had sparked change, and he had every reason to believe that the ripples of that change would continue to spread, reaching far beyond what he could see. And for Nathan, that was a victory worth celebrating. Captain Nathan Reed sat in his living room one quiet evening, reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had transformed his life over the past few months. The fight for respect and accountability had been long, often grueling, and filled with moments of doubt. There were times when he questioned whether his efforts would lead to anything meaningful. Now, as he looked back, he could see how far they had come. It wasn't just about Airlines updating its policies. It was about the cultural shift he had helped ignite, a shift that extended far beyond one airline or one flight. Businesses across the country were taking notice, implementing their own programs to honor and respect veterans and active duty service members. The ripple effect was undeniable. Nathan thought about the soldiers, veterans, and families whose lives had been touched by these changes. The parents who wouldn't have to struggle to find basic amenities while traveling. The soldiers who would feel recognized and respected for their service, not overlooked or dismissed. The veterans who would finally see businesses treating them with the dignity they deserved. It gave him a sense of fulfillment that was hard to put into words. The journey had taught Nathan something profound. Change was never perfect, and it rarely happened as quickly or cleanly as anyone wanted. It was messy, frustrating, and often required far more patience and persistence than seemed fair. But it did happen. Nathan hadn't just fought for himself. He had fought for the next generation of service members. For the soldiers and veterans who would board planes, walk into restaurants, and step into stores, knowing they would be treated with respect. And though the road ahead was still long, Nathan knew the journey had been worth every ounce of effort. The greatest victories, he realized, often come from the battles you never expect to fight. This wasn't a fight Nathan had sought out. It had found him. A moment of disrespect had snowballed into a movement for change, a movement that would resonate far beyond a single incident. As the evening stretched on, Nathan felt a sense of closure. He hadn't just won for himself. He had helped make the world a little better for those who would come after him. And that, to him, was the ultimate victory. The world would keep turning, and the headlines would eventually fade, but the changes he had helped create would endure. In airports, in businesses, and in the everyday interactions that shape how people treat one another, his impact would be felt. Nathan leaned back in his chair, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a catalyst for change, a reminder that even the smallest actions could spark something much larger than anyone could imagine. For Nathan, that was enough. Thank you for reading Nathan's story. If you found it inspiring, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for our next video. Bottom of form.